Today is the 25th of March 2025, and it's a rather somber occasion, because it was the day that Jeremy Clarkson was fired from the BBC, 3 weeks removed from what was Top Gear's very last episode aired under normal circumstances. Nicholas Hoult would prove to be the very last star in a reasonably priced Astra, despite intentions to have Gary Lineker, Henry Cavill, and yes, Keanu Reeves appear throughout the subsequent 3 episodes. What was transmitted on the night of the 8th was a studio session that had actually been filmed several nights earlier, on the evening of the 4th. A date that would end up completely and irreparably tearing the programme apart from the inside out. And yet, for those first 5 days afterwards, the world at large would be blissfully unaware of what had happened. There was nothing seemingly out of the ordinary about the 7th episode of Series 22 at first glance, and everyone assumed it would return for its final 3 episodes, closing off a historic run that was set to be the show's longest ever. 12 episodes, 13 if you wish to include the BBC Red Button exclusive An Evening with Top Gear. Sadly, it just wasn't meant to be. In clicking this video, I presume you are already well aware of what happened to Jeremy Clarkson in March of 2015, and why he never returned to Top Gear again beyond that point outside of paying his final respects to the extremely talented Sabina Schmitz in 2021, someone whose absence is dearly missed. What I hope to achieve with this video is to demonstrate just how dark of a chapter this period was in Jeremy Clarkson's life, and to try and explain why he did what he did during that fateful night 10 years ago in that hotel in North Yorkshire, using everything that we know about that night. Before I made this video, I decided I'd watch and read every single piece of media concerning the fracas that I could get my hands on, from newsreels to clippings to statements to inquiries and even a personal eyewitness account from that night at Dunsfold that's exclusive to this documentary to make sure I hadn't missed anything. And what I've put together is what I believe to be the most complete chronological timeline documenting that dreaded week from within the world of Top Gear, from build-up to fallout. My concern is that unlike most TV shows, Top Gear wasn't allowed the opportunity to die peacefully in its old age, nor was it ordered to the televisual gallows to be placed on the chopping block and executed. Top Gear was murdered in broad daylight, and the chief suspect was none other than lead host and veteran presenter of 23 years, Jeremy Clarkson. Even from within the BBC, it seemed that there was a concerted effort to kill Top Gear as quickly as possible by assassinating the character of Jeremy Clarkson for exploiting his own personal weaknesses and failings. Throughout this video, I will try to exonerate Clarkson's actions as much as humanly possible, all the while naming 7 other people, both from within and outside the BBC, who I feel stood to gain the most from Jeremy Clarkson's dismissal and the upheaval that ensued. I will be prefacing this video by stating that although I do consider myself a fairly authoritative source on Top Gear due to having put in tens of thousands of hours of research that I've been conducting since the 2010s, this narrative may not necessarily be an accurate reflection of what really happened, because the only person in the entire world who knew exactly what was going through his mind in early 2015 was Jeremy Clarkson himself. If you can therefore accept that what I'm about to say may be subject to speculation, then I'm sure you'll no doubt enjoy this video. With that said, it's time to begin. First and foremost, in order to understand the sort of mindset Jeremy Clarkson was in that night, we need to go right back an entire year beforehand to properly put ourselves in Clarkson's shoes. We therefore begin at the dawn of 2014. Top Gear had completed 20 series on the airwaves since its 2002 relaunch, and in that time, it had become the BBC's biggest moneymaker, a status it had held with an iron fist since the start of the decade. No other show was making quite as much money for the corporation as Top Gear, especially since the dissolution of the programme's production company Better Six in the early autumn of 2012. What's worth pointing out, and will be much more elaborated on in the full unabridged Clarkson biopic, is that within 100 hours of Better Six signing over all of Top Gear's intellectual property rights to the BBC in order for Clarkson to receive a £5 million bumper payday, the BBC's own editorial standards committee would censure Clarkson due to his remarks concerning a camper edition for the Toyota Prius, calling it an elephant car as a disparaging reference to Elephant Man Joseph Merrick. These complaints had initially surfaced 7 months earlier, during the broadcast of Top Gear's 18th series, and strangely only became relevant again the moment Clarkson just so happened to no longer be the man in charge of Top Gear. The only reason nothing ultimately came of this and that any further proceedings were suddenly halted 2 days later is because of a little something you might have heard of called Operation U-Tree. Simply put, the BBC's priorities had rapidly shifted to the point they no longer cared about the whole thing, and Clarkson ended up getting off scot-free. As a result, 2013 would therefore be something of a brief oasis of calm for the team, as the BBC had far bigger battlegrounds to fight and a tainted reputation to uphold. But by all accounts, 2014 would make up for this by proving to be an absolutely horrible year for Top Gear. They might have otherwise filmed and recorded some memorable moments, embarked on yet another highly successful world tour, and put together yet another entertaining and enthralling home video exclusive in the form of The Perfect Road Trip 2, but the general sentiment within the Top Gear camp as a whole wasn't a good one to say the least. Even in official contexts, 2014 was considered their annus horribilis due to the sheer amount of bad luck and misfortune which hit various members of the Top Gear team as the year progressed. But of all its members, Jeremy Clarkson would be inarguably hit the hardest. On the 17th of January, Clarkson would post a tweet containing a photograph taken of him while he was asleep on a flight. Judging from the date, this was just before the start of their 2014 World Tour, which was due to kick off in Glasgow the following night. Oddly, far less of a stink was kicked up over the second word, which I've had to blur out to satisfy any censors that might be watching, than would be kicked up over the first. To a normal person, this is merely Clarkson swallowing some of his own pride and sharing with his audience what he felt, as did many others, was a funny moment at his own expense. It was not, nor was it ever intended to be any sort of wider commentary condemning gay people or anyone else. Nonetheless, Clarkson would be forced to apologise. The who exactly didn't seem clear. People that didn't like being called gay Berkshire Hunts? 2 weeks later, in Series 21's first episode, its most controversial moment wouldn't be the point Clarkson demonstrated a very real way to steal an old Vauxhall Nova without its keys, but rather this.
Right, this is called lap of your own car. Ready? I'm going to pop it into neutral. Here we go.
Oh my God, he's gone.
I think this is what George Michael was trying to do.
Small steering input, but he's gone. Let's see if I can get him from the outside.
Out of the car.
Actually on the roof of a moving vehicle.
Genuinely
Yes!
staggered. It worked!
Yes!
Supposedly, despite being shot on a closed airfield and featuring people who were as good as trained professionals, 7 people would ring into Ofcom that night with a complaint that Clarkson glorified dangerous driving. Not 7,000, not 700, 7. A single household's worth of tenants in the entire United Kingdom ringing up to complain was enough to warrant a media storm. In the very same programme, might I add, where mere minutes later each of the hosts were then involved in a mock police chase where fellow Top Gear host James May would end up being depicted as being blown up while still sat inside his Ford Fiesta. Somehow, Clarkson doing a physical lap of his own car in controlled conditions was that much worse. This news article, as presented on Metro by an anonymous reporter, is a genuinely weird read, and it's no wonder they didn't want their name attached to it. For a start, the writer claims Clarkson's act was blasted by fans of Top Gear. Yes, 7 people, whose enthusiasm status over Top Gear wasn't publicly disclosed. The author then states that Hammond and May were somehow forced to film Clarkson's act of getting out of his car and doing a lap of it, as though Jeremy were a stranger holding a gun to their necks and not merely entertaining what their lifelong friend felt would make for some good TV. To which end 99.999% of the 6.12 million people watching that episode had no problem with. The article is written as though anyone with a sound mind is supposed to feel sympathetic towards the literal septet of people in the entire Great British Isles who felt Clarkson's driving was somehow that much more irresponsible than what he was normally putting to TV anyway. With the first week out of the way, the rest of Clarkson's early 2014 was peppered with the occasional flare-up caused by a controversial tweet or utterance, including an early encounter with Michael Van Erp, better known nowadays as the societal gonorrhea that calls himself Cycling Mikey. In another January tweet, Clarkson had expressed his displeasure over what he referred to as finger-pointing cyclists, which Van Erp took exception to. This more or less directly resulted in the creation of the Cyclist film, which appeared during the 5th episode of Series 21. During the 2 weeks which then followed episode 5, Top Gear would subsequently air the Burma special, which saw Clarkson and his 2 pals take a trio of hulking great lorries into the Burmese wilderness. Like most of the specials which had preceded it, this special was another general laugh fest scripted just enough to be entertaining whilst avoiding falling into wooden predictable slapstick. Towards the end of the second part, they were instructed to build a wooden bridge over what they purportedly believed was the River Kwai, but turned out to actually be the River Cock. In a scene that would then be deleted from all future TV showings and even the eventual home video release on DVD and Blu-ray, here's what Clarkson and Hammond said on the night of the 16th of March 2014, the maiden airing of the second part, while a presumed Myanmar native surveyed the bridge they had built.
That is a proud moment. But there's a slope on it.
Throughout Top Gear's 13 years on the air, this would perhaps turn out to be the team's biggest mistake. Being brutally honest, however, it just wasn't their fault. Now, for those of you born near to or during the 21st century, there might be some confusion here. For most people, this quip didn't even register as a joke, let alone a racial one. Many comments on this clip on YouTube were equally bewildered, with many thinking Clarkson was making a genuine observance as to the offset of the bridge they'd built. But historically, the word slope has been used as an epithet towards people of Oriental Asian heritage, and out of everything that had been spoken in the program throughout the years leading up to this moment, none would ever prove to be as controversial as this one. What a lot of commentators don't realise, however, is that when looking back at this controversy from a retrospective standpoint, is that it didn't surface because a human rights group had taken exception with Clarkson's joke. There wasn't an uprising from the Myanmar embassy, or objections from a high-ranking politician like there'd been with Malaysia, for instance. There wasn't an injunction from a high court or other commission like there'd been with India. They hadn't created a diplomatic emergency like they had with Mexico. There weren't thousands of complaints from Top Gear viewers of an East Asian heritage, or even hundreds of them. Even saying that there were 7 complaints in this instance would be completely disingenuous. The Burma controversy was not, as was so many other Top Gear controversies, based around a mountain of complaints that Ofcom received, as many might have first perceived it to be. And this is something I am very passionate about in setting the record completely straight over. The entire slope controversy would be instigated by a single person who wasn't even a resident of the country. Allow me to introduce person of interest number 1 to the stand, the only individual who was living throughout the entire British Isles who not only caught on that Jeremy's joke in Burma was a racial double entendre, but actually got on a high horse to complain about it, was an actress and screenwriter by the name of Sharmista Somi Guha, now known as Somi D'Souza, a woman of Indian heritage who came to the UK in 2004, but throughout that entire time was actually a legal subject of the United States. So, who exactly was this charming lady? Let's take a look, shall we?
They were a bunch of gormless tossers, weren't they? Wouldn't have known real talent if it came up and gnawed off one of their greasy, sausage-thick fingers.
Obviously, with Oscar-winning acting credentials such as these, Guha felt she was destined for far better things in life, and upon her arrival in the country she'd partner with Edmund Glinecki to produce a series of extremely low-budget films and prospective TV pilots that she felt didn't treat her as a one-dimensional stereotypical sex object, as can be evidenced from the pilot you just saw called Mistress Kalai's London. As per her profile on Media Diversified, Guha's time at the professional level of the industry was voluntarily cut short because she quickly noticed that not only were mainstream roles limited for her racial background, but there was an overwhelming focus on racially stereotypical themes. So instead of trying to build a genuine career for herself through smaller roles that she might not have been a fan of personally, but at least helping to get her foot in the door, she decided to throw a hissy fit over the status quo and make a bunch of pompous, self-aggrandizing junk that literally no one has ever seen. If the situation was truly as bad as Guha had made it out to be, people like Archie Punjabi pretty much would never have had a career. Yet from the get-go, and at the age of 30 no less, Punjabi broke through to the mainstream by means of appearing in a fair few high-grossing films before an iconic television role as Kalinda Sharma in The Good Wife emerged. And although the role was subject to a fair amount of unrealism that plagued a lot of the action and superhero content that came out around the 2010s, such as this scene where Kalinda ends up absolutely emasculating an older, stockier male aggressor despite doing so while being dressed up like she's about to do an advert for Prada, it became the benchmark that the rest of her career would be graded against. At its core, it was undeniable proof that someone who looked like Somi Guha, with a similar build type and who resided in the same country as her, could make it big in the entertainment industry if she actually bothered to put in the work required to make it happen, instead of just endlessly pretending that the whole world was out to get her. Perhaps the oddest thing about the whole ordeal was that the British media would try its absolute hardest to make Guha look like she was somebody, repeatedly referring to her in the press as either an actress on ITV's long-running police drama The Bill, or as a star in the acclaimed 2006 Alfonso Cuarón movie Children of Men. In reality, she was a walk-on role for a single episode of The Bill in 2008, by which point the show had long since passed its peak cultural relevance, and her role in Children of Men was so insignificant it's not even listed in the film's supporting cast on Wikipedia. Therefore, it's here that we may introduce suspect number 2, Lawrence Davies. In Somi Guhar's attempt to take down Jeremy Clarkson, she'd employ the services of Lawrence Davies' firm Equal Justice Solicitors, a name and organisation that wasn't exactly unfamiliar to Top Gear fans of the era, given his firm was also enlisted by David King of Barbados Underground, a man with clear mental instability issues who once wanted half of Top Gear's entire production team to be fired, sending his letters to the Barbadian embassy in London, where upon their arrival they were most likely tossed into the bin. It's here that I should mention Davies' own LinkedIn page was written by AI, a fact he holds no shame over, and perhaps demonstrates the level of professionalism that Equal Justice Solicitors represented. Together, Guhar and Davies would demand the BBC to suspend Top Gear programming until allegations of racism were investigated and dealt with. At least, that's what was published in the majority of British media outlets and was actually far from Guhar's only demand. To learn the whole story, we have to go to the website of Labour councillor Salman Shaheen, a rather peculiar connection for a small-time actress to have, which published Guhar's complaint in full in the weeks following her initial outburst. Put simply, an apology was never going to be enough. She also wanted $1.8 million in damages, which is utterly insane when you realise the quip wasn't aimed towards her or even her own race. And she basically wanted to destroy Clarkson's entire career over one perceived slight. Above all else, her complaint was based on the idea that people like her didn't advance in the industry, not because they weren't good enough at their roles despite all the connections she had that less fortunate and less affluent individuals didn't, but rather that they were being actively held back. Her solution to this problem was to effectively extort money from a group of people who were each infinitely more talented than her in order to cover up her own failings as a writer and actress. With all this added hoo-ha that Guhar had managed to kick up, the BBC strangely relented and decided that this would actually serve as the first of Jeremy Clarkson's 3 strikes, with the third resulting in his immediate termination from Top Gear. This was extremely shocking, because it meant that a single US citizen who had managed to see a joke that 7 million other people had missed and subsequently took offense to it could therefore somehow influence executive decisions surrounding the most popular TV program on the planet. Above all else, the precedent of this case established was actually quite frightening and built on a non-controversy of Clarkson's lap of his golf. It meant that if even one person in the entire United Kingdom, regardless if they were even a citizen or not, took exception to something that was said on Top Gear, that one person not only had to be listened to, but catered to, with Clarkson being punished for offending them. Within the span of 2.5 years, the BBC had gone from defending Clarkson in the House of Commons over comments tens of thousands of people had protested, to shamelessly licking the boots of a single overly privileged complainant who wasn't even a citizen of the country. Everything that happened in the year that followed, up to and including the creation of the Grand Tour, was indirectly a result of her protestations and the seditious BBC employees who bothered to actually give her the time of day instead of telling her to jog on back to America and mind her own business. One person was given the power to dictate what 5 million people in the UK and hundreds of millions more all around the world were allowed to enjoy. And to me, that's not the sort of power any single entity should just be able to wield. One person should not be an arbiter for more than a million others. Since the controversy, the career of Guhar, since D'Souza, didn't quite take off in the way she might have expected it to, as evidenced by how she seized ownership over the production company she created with Glenicke in 2016 and promptly shut it down. She had a walk-on role in the uninspired and critically panned 2021 Tom and Jerry reboot, had a cameo in the Apple TV series Trying, which some of you might have heard of, along with most recently a recurring role in the Paramount bust Curfew, based on a hyper-feminist power fantasy written by an author who looks exactly as you'd imagine them to look, and who actually has less followers on Twitter than I do, making me wonder as to when my TV deal's going to come through. The ultimate outcome of this controversy was that the BBC issued Clarkson with an ultimatum, where if he said or did 2 more things that the corporation felt were unacceptable, he'd be fired. However, it turned out Clarkson didn't actually have to say anything, because it turned out he'd already said it a whole year earlier. and yet again it would be the Mirror who'd break the news to the world, whether they actually wanted to hear it or not. First aired on the 10th of February 2013, this was how the closing scene of Jeremy Clarkson's Toyota GT86 vs Subaru BRZ track test originally ended.
Eeny, meeny, miny, mo, catch a teacher by his toe. When he squeals, let him go. Eeny, meeny, miny, mo.
Clarkson deciding that the Toyota was better simply because of a nursery rhyme. However, what we didn't know at the time was that this wasn't the initial take. Originally, Clarkson didn't even sing the rhyme, he mumbled it, and because he mumbled it, people believed he was saying something completely different.
Eeny, meeny, miny, mo. When he squeals, let him go. Eeny, meeny, miny, mo.
Now, whether you believe Clarkson did utter that particular word or not is irrelevant. Pointing to how he garbled his words at the most opportune time and used the word he as opposed to it, which you normally would if you were referring to a tiger, is entirely missing the point. Maybe he actually was about to say it on purpose to mockingly troll Ofcom behind their back, in a take that was never going to go to air, as any car dealership, workers' union or 70s children's show can attest. Maybe he didn't say it, and simply mumbled because he couldn't decide whether to say tiger, teacher or something else, and realised what it sounded like during playback. What I'm not going to do here is insult the viewer's intelligence by suggesting that Clarkson simply wasn't aware of the version of the rhyme he is alleged to have uttered, because he almost absolutely was. This is because it was the version of the rhyme that had been popularised by Rudyard Kipling's anthology, Land and Sea Tales, The Scouts and Guides. Tens of millions of British schoolchildren born between the outbreak of World War I all the way through to the throes of Beatlemania would have been exposed to this book and the altered version of the rhyme. And although Clarkson would admit to saying this version of the rhyme and apologised for it in a video he'd post on Twitter afterwards, there is a possibility he was entirely innocent and merely came clean to avoid the mess that an official BBC inquest and a public witch hunt would have yielded, which he'd had quite enough of over the previous 3 years. Even the people tasked with professionally analysing the audio submitted to the Mirror couldn't be certain over what Clarkson actually said, with Michelle Bowman of audio forensics organisation CY4OR unable to determine if he'd actually said the offending word or not, given that both tiger and that word sound identical when mumbled in the manner that Clarkson did. Furthermore, the production notes for the episode allegedly saw Clarkson bin the offending takes due to believing that it did sound like he uttered the epithet, which strangely doesn't seem they were turned in as evidence, as that would surely be enough to exonerate him in a court of law not staffed by utter clowns. If Bowman was genuinely unsure what Clarkson said was the words she believed him to have said with only 75% certainty, then why weren't the BBC taking them to task over that final 25%? Why were the BBC so nonplussed over the welfare of its highest paid on-screen talent, a person who was being paid more than the company's Director General, to just sit about and let him take punishment after punishment? Why were the BBC allowing a single random US citizen to damage the integrity of its biggest moneymaker in such a cavalier manner, as well as attempting to extort money for hard work she had no hand in creating? 2.5 years earlier, Tony Hall's predecessor Mark Thompson had gone to Parliament to bat for Clarkson in the face of 30,000 complaints. That was back during the final days of Beta 6, when Clarkson and his closest compadres owned the intellectual property rights to Top Gear. Now that he didn't, and that it had been broken up for 5 million pieces of silver, it was like they just didn't care anymore. Of course, Somi Guha would also make sure to stick her nose in and offer her 2 cents, even though she had no relevance to this controversy whatsoever, wondering just how many chances they were going to give to Jeremy Clarkson. Gee, it's almost as if Clarkson was a world-renowned and beloved entertainer at the helm of the most popular TV show on the planet, something Guha would have understood if she'd actually had a sizable fanbase outside of the scorned woman club. In short, Clarkson's second warning here was nothing more than a complete joke, an absolute farce. If deleted footage that was leaked to a newspaper with no intention of ever airing was enough to yield real-world repercussions, then at what limit did the BBC draw personal privacy at? Were Top Gear hosts even allowed to have their own personal thoughts anymore, or would the BBC have to vet those as well? Or what was perhaps the biggest question that one should have asked the BBC in that first half of 2014 is why weren't the BBC publicly investigating the source of the leak? At its core, this is footage that was never meant to go to air. How the footage then made it to general circulation is completely unknown, given that it was likely junked as far back as the airfield. The footage could not have leaked itself, so someone must have discovered it, obtained it, and leaked it for some sort of personal or financial gain in their private grievances against Clarkson. There is, however, perhaps an answer to this conundrum. Enter person of interest number 3, Danny Cohen. Cohen was a noted opponent of Top Gear as its sustained success continued to fly in the face of the televisual egalitarian utopia that Cohen wanted to build during his leadership tenure at BBC Two, which he had started by declaring that panel shows would no longer feature all-male lineups. It's this peculiar detail of Cohen's demands that perhaps led to Stephen Fry's shock departure from QI in 2015 a year later, who otherwise cited budgetary reasons for leaving the programme and was then replaced by Sandy Toksvig. When the outtake scandal occurred, Cohen immediately wanted to fire Clarkson, a decision that allegedly cost him his friendship with former channel controller Alan Yentob, but was shut down by the Director General at the time and suspect number 4, Tony Hall. Cohen made himself no secret of his career ambitions to become the BBC's youngest ever Director General, and the media decided to lavish him with insufferable amounts of lip service, declaring him an animal who had the guts to go against Jeremy Clarkson. In reality, Cohen appears to have been little more than a bit of a tail-tucking coward, as according to Clarkson, Cohen pussyfooted around talking to him directly, instead subjecting him to what Clarkson referred to as 6 layers of management. He'd eventually leave the BBC a year later, so much for that Director General ambition, joining Access Entertainment in a venture that has allowed him, in the past couple of years, to slap his name on and collect awards for a whole bunch of A24 productions he didn't have a single hand in writing. As per an excerpt in Richard Porter's autobiography, the BBC would launch an investigation, but not to investigate the source of the leak. The BBC wanted to find out if the Top Gear production team were all secretly racists behind the scenes, dubbing their investigation as a health check. This infuriated members of the team to no end, with one long-term cameraman refusing to be interviewed, going on record as to state that he'd worked on the show for a long time and that if he truly didn't like the atmosphere, he'd have quit whenever he wanted to. In the end, the results from the BBC's internal report were collected and then withheld, outrightly refusing to show the Top Gear team their findings, but coming to the conclusion that what Top Gear needed was another executive producer. The team effectively told them to get stuffed. 6 months after these controversies had ran their course in November 2014, Tony Hall would publicly state that Clarkson expressing remorse for his outtake that never should have hit public airwaves was what ultimately spared him the sack, with channel controller Danny Cohen already desperate to fire him. Funnily enough, this article actually says far more about Hall's character as an individual than it ever did Clarkson's, as the warning signs for what were about to happen just a matter of months later were actually visible for all to see, provided one reads in between the lines and has a fair bit of hindsight to play with. For a start, Hall would state that there were no plans to undermine the Archers, as an example of his commitment to upholding the BBC's traditions. What this essentially meant was that Hall cared more about a largely irrelevant radio drama that was a living vestige of a BBC long gone by than the televisual juggernaut that was single-handedly keeping the BBC's home fires burning year upon year. Perhaps the one quote that exposed where Hall's true loyalties lay was his reaction towards the Top Gear fans who felt passionate about the programme and over Jeremy Clarkson. He said that there were millions of people who felt Top Gear reflected their interests and that he had to respect that. In reality, this was just a bunch of meaningless bureaucratic gobbledygook, which effectively translates to, myself and my esteemed associates think Top Gear is a contradiction of the overall brand image we're trying to build, but its enduring popularity means we're gonna keep it going in spite of this. Because we like the money it brings us and allows us to fund some pathetic, pandering dross that would never get commissioned otherwise. In the first few months of 2014, Jeremy Clarkson had been attacked from every side imaginable, but his life wasn't about to get any easier. What was almost certainly the worst thing that happened in Jeremy Clarkson's 2014 would be the sad death of his mother Shirley on the 24th of March. Having lived to the age of 79, Shirley was Clarkson's constant guiding light for the first 53 years of Jeremy's life, the one person he could always reliably turn to when the going got tough, and no matter how bad of a state Jeremy had got himself into, she would always find a way to get him out of his mess through her ceaseless care and wisdom. Losing Shirley was a major psychological blow to Clarkson's overall sanity, and if there was a point he was going to go off the rails, now would surely be the time. and on the 1st of May, after 21 years of marriage, it was rumoured that Clarkson and his wife Frances were to split up. Within days, the news would be made official. Smelling fresh blood in the water, the Mirror would rather pathetically try to launch a third attack against Jeremy Clarkson on the 10th of May 2014, barely a week after they tried to topple him with the leaked outtakes. This time around, they dug even further into Clarkson's past than a year earlier by claiming that during his days at Gabrielle Designs, his parents' firm, he sold Golly toys and took great pride in selling them. For those who don't know what Golly toys are, for over 75 years they were considered the mascot of jam and preserve company Robertson's, and under a modern light are usually considered racially insensitive. Since the 2010s, anyone who openly displays Golly toys is considered a bigger threat to the UK's national security than those who perform genuinely terroristic acts, with various police forces invariably wasting taxpayer money getting them removed whenever someone spots one and decides they're going to be a bit of a goo-ha about it. The Mirror's story actively attempted to shame Clarkson for his prior association with the sale of Golly-themed toys, even though regardless if he did, there was little to no societal stigma associated with them in the 1970s when Clarkson purportedly sold them. This is without even delving into just how disgustingly insensitive this whole story was, being written barely more than a month after the death of Clarkson's mother. Fortunately, no one was prepared to fall for the slippery slander of old Bobby Maxwell's balls for a third time, and things calmed down for a bit. Having had a few crucial months to regroup, Top Gear's 22nd series would soon be upon the horizon, and the decision was made to precede it with a 2-part Christmas special, similar to how they'd started Series 16 back in 2011. The Patagonia special would see the Top Gear trio celebrate the 50th anniversary of the small block V8, and embark on a drive through Argentina from Bariloche to Ushuaia via Chile. Although the first half of the special would go according to plan, with Clarkson regaling his heartbreaking tale of why he chose the Porsche 928 and what it meant to him personally, the second half would prove to be derailed by a group of disgruntled thugs who were not happy to learn that a bunch of TV personalities from the island they considered as occupying the Falklands were coming over to temporarily occupy the mainland. But to make matters far worse, like a red rag to a bull, Jeremy Clarkson's Porsche had a very unfortunate number plate, H982 FKL. This might look innocuous to some, but to a passionate Argentinian nationalist with a brain the size of an empanada, this plate says 1982 Falkland, as though Clarkson was somehow gloating over the UK's victory in the war that had happened 30 years earlier. Not even photographs of the car from years before the Top Gear shoot, along with documentation which undeniably proved the car's authenticity, were enough to convince Argentinian authorities, who otherwise decided to ignore the facts and construct their own chosen narrative, and simply weren't interested in considering anything that disproved that narrative. To them, the plate was specifically designed to court controversy by annoying Argentinians, and it had to have been contrived from the special. Their evidence? A personalised number plate in the crew's possession, which read BE11END. Bellend. As a result, Top Gear's crew were made targets by a group of hundreds, likely thousands of angry Argentinian nationalists who had, and let's not be hyperbolic here, intentions to seriously hurt, if not kill, everyone in the convoy, including the crew, several members of which were injured from the various altercations. Reflecting on the event at the end of the year during his appearance on the Jonathan Ross show in December, Clarkson found himself entirely unable to joke about what had happened, with the program's security team, some of whom had served in Iraq and Afghanistan, claiming it was the most dangerous situation they'd ever been put in. It also showed just how grossly ineffective and negligent the local law enforcement were that they had to then ford an illegal river crossing back into Chile in order to make sure they weren't skinned alive. Clarkson would personally single out Danny Cohen as having failed to support him and the rest of the Top Gear team during this incident, claiming he felt as though they'd been thrown to the wolves. And quite honestly, it's very hard to argue against that. Though the year had ended on something of a high note thanks to the 2-part Patagonia special, sweeping up views from 7.25 million television sets across the country, a brief ray of sunshine could not detract from the very dark cloud that now surrounded its lead presenter and the rest of the Top Gear team in a mist of controversy. The writing was very much on the wall at this point, regardless of what Clarkson did, owing to his impending third warning, and the forecast for what lay ahead was therefore rather grim. The BBC had basically forced themselves into a corner where if Clarkson appeared to do anything wrong, whether on the screen or off it, his job would be in immediate jeopardy with zero chance of appeal. By this point, it wasn't so much a case of if Clarkson got fired in the next couple of years, but but rather when. Speaking to BBC Radio 2 DJ Chris Evans at the beginning of December, rather ironic given what would happen a few months later, Jeremy Clarkson opined that in spite of what had happened in Argentina, Top Gear's overarching global popularity proved that the programme couldn't be all that bad. Even more ironically, Evans would pose a question to Clarkson over what he'd do if he ever lost his job. He'd reply rather stoically, stating that he'd be a newspaper journalist, exactly where his career had begun 35 years earlier. But if they thought 2014 was a bad year, nothing would be able to prepare them for the utter turd storm that 2015 had to offer. Upon his return to Top Gear programming, Jeremy Clarkson would have a lot of fun in those first few weeks back on the air. He'd drive a hover van across the rivers of St. Petersburg, go for a grueling Northern Territory drive in Australia which saw him attempt to herd thousands of cattle like he had done on Motorworld all those years ago, and he tried to build a golf-sponsored ambulance out of an old Porsche not too dissimilar to the one he'd abandoned in Argentina, with hilarious results. He challenged his preconceptions regarding electric cars by comparing BMW's brand new i8 against its brand new M3, narrowly favouring the older, more established fire breather. In the 5th episode, Clarkson, along with the help of James May, presented a living eulogy towards Peugeot's history that is, according to this humble Top Gear viewer, the funniest film they ever put together in the sense that it was not only humorous, but factual to boot, and at one point even saw the team converge on Clarkson's own house. For those first few weeks at the beginning of 2015, it was like everything was right with the world once again. Any fears of Clarkson being fired were to be left in the fiery pits of 2014, whence they belonged, and that this would be a brand new year with a brand new Clarkson. And indeed it was, just not in the way anyone could have ever imagined. With that said, as the weeks progressed, the filming schedule was beginning to take its toll, with their newest live UK tour, starting in February and kicking off in Liverpool and Newcastle. Clarkson was spread thin, and those weren't the only things Jeremy had to worry about. His future on Top Gear was at stake. This was because his first contract to be signed post-Beta 6 was now expiring, and had Clarkson chosen to renew it, it would have kept him locked to the BBC until 2018, by which point he'd be 57 years old, along with a non-compete clause that likely would have extended things even further into 2020, when Clarkson would be due to turn 60. From there, you must consider all the pressures Clarkson was facing at this point in life. In the span of a year, he'd effectively lost his entire family owing to his divorce and the death of his mother, with Top Gear co-hosts James May and Richard Hammond becoming his own surrogate family, with the programme as their child. Tabloid news outlets such as The Mirror were looking to tear Clarkson's throat out over the slightest indiscretion he might have historically committed, and even his own superiors at the BBC wanted nothing to do with him, routinely failing to stick up for Clarkson and leaving him for dead whenever they weren't metaphorically clubbing him around the earholes or making him kiss their feet. For the first time in nearly 20 years, Jeremy Clarkson was fastly reaching his breaking point. The only question left on the table was whether or not he could make it to the end of Series 22 and keep his head on straight. To Clarkson's credit, the series was proving to be a massive hit in spite of the fact that the BBC were yet again sabotaging its success by pitting it against their own Call the Midwife programme on the other side, a decision that Danny Cohen, surprise surprise, had masterminded during his days as controller of BBC One. Ratings-wise, the number of people tuning in to watch Top Gear was at its highest in years. Both halves of the Patagonia special had comfortably cleaned house in excess of 7 million people tuning in, a rare figure at this point in Top Gear's life, whereas the first 6 seasonal episodes all managed to surpass 6 million in spite of what it was up against on the other station. Though longer seasons of Top Gear had traditionally bore a tendency to meander around the mundane the longer they stayed on air, Series 22's forecasted 10-episode run would be rock solid in its overall composition, with not a single film that had aired in those first 6 weeks being less than the best of what the team had to offer, and the hype towards the Holy Trinity shootout in which Clarkson was set to change his name to Jennifer continued to mount in the background. Already, by the end of February 2015, Top Gear seemed to be more culturally relevant than it had been for years. VOD requests for the latest episodes on iPlayer comparatively dwarfed everything else on the platform, including the much-promoted live episodes of EastEnders. The BBC would find themselves regularly raking in hundreds of millions of pounds a year over the sustained success of Top Gear, but 2015 looked as though it could have been their best year yet. Finally, it seemed that everyone not only in the Top Gear camp, but also within the greater BBC, had finally settled on the same page as each other. Sadly, it wasn't long before something clearly stunk beneath the surface. Those aforementioned VOD requests were strangely and almost aggressively downplayed by the BBC in favour of emphasising the EastEnders live episodes, which weren't as much of a success, an omission that the Guardian newspaper would even criticise them for. On the 23rd of February 2015, Jeremy Clarkson appeared to declare war on the entire city of Liverpool, after its local newspaper, The Echo, often known for stirring up dissent against various public figures over the years, accused Clarkson of giving the city a bad rep. This would be due to his Sunday Times article published one day earlier that described a particularly unpleasant experience he'd had in a restaurant before effectively eulogising the North as a far grimmer place than the South. The Echo then carefully misconstrued those words, along with omitting any praise Clarkson had over the city to make it seem as though he held nothing but disdain over Liverpool as a whole. Commenters on social media were quick to call out the Echo's yellow journalism, but the newspaper succeeded in baiting the right people, including Liverpool's mayor, Joe Anderson, who embarrassingly wrote to the BBC complaining that Clarkson was set to appear at the BBC showcase in the city and that his presence wouldn't be wanted. Predictably, Jeremy Clarkson would become quite cross, and he was totally in the right to be, as what the Echo did verged on libel by manipulating his words by omission. He'd post a tweet branding the Echo as f***wards, and things naturally continue to escalate from there. It was undeniable at this point. The atmosphere within Top Gear's inner circle was growing increasingly tense on a virtually daily basis, with Jeremy Clarkson the hapless figure in the middle. On the 26th of February 2015, Clarkson would embattle himself in a war of words against the Labour Shadow Transport Secretary of the era, Michael Duggar, who branded Clarkson as an idiot. In his own words, Duggar would argue that Clarkson was not a spokesperson for the car in the UK, but that rather he was. Duggar's argument, if he was actually being serious, was fairly hollow. Clarkson was a man who'd spent the better part of 35 years extolling the virtues of car enthusiasm. For lack of a better term, he wasn't just a mere spokesperson for the car. He was the living incarnation of everything that represented automotive enthusiasm. He'd risen through the ranks of newspaper journalism into magazine journalism before getting his big break in television journalism. Duggar was merely an elected bureaucrat, and one that almost certainly wasn't consciously elected by the vast majority of those driving cars in the UK to help represent their interests. A man temporarily filling in a post because the man before him hadn't done a good enough job to keep it. For those curious, Duggar would hold his seat from November 2014 until he was reassigned in September 2015, a mere 7 months after making these statements, before he'd be booted from the Labour Party altogether by Jeremy Corbyn at the beginning of 2016. So not a very compelling case for Mr. Duggar on the whole. The most destructive week of Jeremy Clarkson's life would then begin on the 1st of March 2015, the same Sunday as Series 22's 6th episode would go to air, with Clarkson spending that afternoon watching Ireland's dominant 19-9 victory over England in the Six Nations Cup, as he sat within an Irish pub. As time would tell, this certainly wouldn't be the last time Clarkson would embroil himself in an English-Irish conflict that week. 4 hours later, as Top Gear aired on TV, he'd get into a rather heated online discussion with a Twitter user by the name of Alec1988, whose account would eventually be suspended and whose original message is largely unknown, but seemed to be a criticism towards Clarkson's presentation of Top Gear as of late. This spat seemed to actually unnerve Clarkson, whose normally vibrant Twitter profile would otherwise remain entirely silent for the next 7 days thereafter. As an aside, less than a week earlier, Clarkson seemed to prophetically predict his own imminent firing from Top Gear with a sarcastic job search tweet that perhaps wasn't as joking as it first seemed on the surface. On Monday, the 2nd of March 2015, the wheels for what were about to happen in the next 48 hours would be set irrevocably in motion, following a visit to the doctors amid Clarkson's growing concerns over a pair of lumps that had started forming on his tongue. Following a consultation intended to allay his fears, he was told sternly by his doctor that it was very likely to be a form of mouth cancer and that if he cared about his own well-being, he needed to take some time off. Despite writing about this in his weekly column, this bit of information went almost entirely ignored by mainstream media outlets, other than a single coordinated boilerplate article that would be published that April. But I think, in retrospect, this was the exact moment Jeremy Clarkson's mind was finally made up, after weeks, possibly even months of uncertainty. Over the past year, a series of walls had been erected around him, boxing him in from every conceivable angle. Thanks to his extramarital relationship with Top Gear Live mastermind Philippa Sage, he'd been divorced and kicked out of the family home he'd lived in for over 2 decades. With the death of his mother, he'd lost arguably the single guiding light that he'd had for his entire life, and had kept him on the straight and narrow. The other major love of his life, Top Gear, seemed to be growing increasingly distant from him, with 2 warnings being piled against him in short order, and the BBC threatening to fire him if he so much as cast a funny look to his paymasters, and the corporation outrightly refusing to stand by him when he needed their support the most and as his contract was about to expire. Put bluntly, after many months of ceaseless abuse, Jeremy Clarkson's last tether had finally snapped. We don't know for sure what he did on the 3rd of March, as the events of what he might have done that day seem to be lost to history, but based on the timeline that can be constructed from the days leading up to and following it, it almost certainly wasn't a good day for him due to reinforced worries over his cancer scare. And as he readied himself for another intense day of filming, possibly the most intense day of filming of his entire life. And yet, it wouldn't be in some far-flung corner of the world where he'd be held up by gangsters or shot at by terrorists. It would be right on his metaphorical doorstep in North Yorkshire. But there was a reason as to why this shoot proved much more difficult than any he'd done before. First and foremost, it was extremely unusual at this point that Top Gear would continue to be filmed this late into an ongoing series, with the final films usually shot around 3 to 4 weeks into a series' initial run. Even for series such as Series 9, with that series' final film shot just after its 3rd episode went to air. For Series 22, the show was now gearing up for an 8th episode, and principal photography was still yet to conclude. Anything that had to be filmed beyond this point needed to be in an airable state within 20 days or less, which in the high-octane world of TV was the equivalent of doing your homework in the late hours of Sunday night. The show's producer Andy Willman was now spending entire days locked inside the edit suite, putting each of the episodes together as the transmission deadlines for each week grew nearer and nearer. What was odder still was that Series 22 had been an ongoing production that had started nearly a whole year earlier, and had continued for the entire year of 2014, with hardly a single pause in between. Returning to 2015, the morning of the 4th of March would be spent in North Yorkshire, where Clarkson and his 2 co-presenters would take an eclectic mix of modern sports cars for a gallivant along the region's famed moors and valleys. Based on the extremely limited information that exists concerning this shoot, it is believed James May was behind the wheel of the new Porsche 911 GTS, Richard Hammond the Rolls-Royce Wraith, and Clarkson in the far less flashy Ford Fiesta ST. The film itself had been titled internally as The Fizz, alluding to a groinal sensation that James May had first reported during the filming of Series 14, which had aired 5 years earlier. The 4th of March would prove to be a highly unusual day for Jeremy Clarkson, as due to it being a Wednesday meant it not only was a filming day, but also an obligatory studio day. Once they'd motored around the moors for a few hours and taken a few beauty shots in the process, they then had to set everything aside and immediately set off for Dunsfold in order to record the studio films, and when he got there, he wasn't in the best of spirits. Those of us who tuned in and watched Series 22 Episode 7 of Top Gear Live would probably not have noticed anything out of the ordinary, but with almost an entire decade of hindsight at our fingertips, this single shot says about 10,000 words in its own right. Something major is clearly perturbing Clarkson to a great extent. His eyes are uncharacteristically wide and weary. But to absolutely know for sure, it's here that I would like to introduce a man whose photography immortalised that final night in the hangar, a Flickr user by the name of Mark 1 Alpha, who I've previously mentioned in my Cornwall documentary. What I have in my possession is a completely unique account of that night from someone who was actually there in the studio, and this is the first time anyone has ever heard this story. To avoid butchering Mark's recollection of events more than a decade on, here it is in its unabridged, unmodified totality.
It's been a long time now, but still a very memorable day for an avid TG fan as I was. I don't think Clarkson acted any differently at all, although the off-camera stuff I have nothing to compare with, as this was my first and only time at Dunsfold for a Top Gear filming session. He was extremely funny with the audience before filming started. For example, the floor manager came in before him and moved a few people away from the front row, explaining that certain fabric patterns on clothing causes strobing effects on the HD cameras. A few minutes later, Clarkson walks in and says, "Oh, did the floor manager move anyone?" mentioning strobing. Logically, Yes, we said, it's nothing to do with that. He thinks you're ugly. He'd then ask, is everyone having a great time? To which we'd naturally respond, yes, followed by, for fuck's sake, can you let your faces know then when the cameras are on? All typical Clarkson persona-style banter you'd expect. And so by the time the theme tune played in after the clapping rehearsal for the sound levels, the whole crowd were at ease and seemed really happy. In terms of retakes, not really. I guess it would have been the usual stuff. For example, during a piece to camera, one of the trio would pause, assuming they were being spoken to by Andy Willman outside in the gallery truck, and then say, we've been asked by outside to do that again. Sometimes one of them would say, can we do that again? Or deliberately swear, and then turn round to the crowd and say, well, they won't be using that on Sunday now, will they? To much appreciation. Between scenes, the hangar is really small, and so there was a bit where the Mazda MX-5 had to be moved out and make way for the Eagle E-Type. When this happens, everyone is told not to move from their standing spot, so when it goes out, there's continuity between scenes. However, oftentimes between these scenes, Clarkson would shout, who's got my fags? Before disappearing outside for a smoke. I figured that this was normal behavior, as Clarkson was known as a professional smoker. All in all, I was quite taken with how smoothly this type of program is put together. Things filmed out of sequence. We would be asked to clap before Hammond or May would start talking, and then by the time you watch the episode, that was us clapping the VT segment we'd see later to segue back into the studio. Seemed like organized chaos on the day, yet seamless when you watch the same thing back on Sunday. One thing I will always remember was at the end, after the end credit music had played, and this seemed rather prescient given what hit the news the day after. Clarkson apologized to everyone and said that ordinarily they would hang around for a chat, sign autographs, take photos, etc. However, instead he said, unfortunately, we all have to get into that helicopter that has just landed outside and head off to Yorkshire. Willman has told us that there's a certain number of episodes of this series left, and we're short of at least 2 pieces we have to fill, so we're off to Yorkshire right now to get that done. Overall, I was really grateful for the opportunity to go there. It was an all-day experience. Amazing how it can take 5+ hours for a 1-hour TV show, which nearly half is pre-recorded videotapes. But there was an awful lot of light-hearted cocking around between all 3 of the presenters and the floor crew.
All things considered, when you realised how much work he'd done in not only the hours leading up to the live studio session, but the days, weeks and even months leading up to that shoot, as well as the general state of mind he'd found himself in, Jeremy Clarkson should probably not have been in the hangar that night. He should have taken a break, gathered his bearings and returned a stronger man the week after, or even just went home for the rest of the series to sort his personal health problems out. The problem was partly down to Clarkson's own pride. By prior proclamation, in a career that had now spanned 37 years, he'd never taken a single day off, and he certainly wasn't going to start now because of some petty inner turmoil. In Series 12, for instance, Clarkson had elected to spend half the series with a nasty throat infection and some artificial saliva in a bottle over taking any sort of leave, and it was this ceaseless, workaholic mindset that probably did Clarkson in the most. We didn't know it on the date, but this would be the very last time we'd ever see Jeremy Clarkson bid his farewell to the Top Gear audience. What happened had already happened 4 days earlier, but due to complete media silence, no one outside of the Top Gear production crew, those within the BBC's uppermost echelons, and a few elderly hotel patrons knew anything about the pressing dilemma that was now facing Top Gear that millions of us were blissfully unaware of. Because as soon as the cameras stopped rolling, a pivotal moment for Top Gear would occur, unfolding at the Symonston Hall in the Yorkshire Dales, mere hours after Jeremy Clarkson had bid his farewell to the TV audience and the crew packed up their things in preparation for the next episode a week later. An episode that would sadly never come. With filming done for the day, the team opted to retire inside their production office, munching on a pork pie and a glass of something tepid. The following morning, they'd be needed back a full 300 miles away at Hawes, the village they had abandoned filming at earlier that same day in order to film their prerequisite studio shoot. Given the time of day, the amount of distance that needed to be covered by the team, and the fact that all 3 presenters were already thoroughly shattered from having pulled double duties, the production team decided it was probably best to have the 3 presenters airlifted back to the hotel in a helicopter. Before they boarded, each of the presenters then decided to chill out in the room near the back of the production office and took a couple minutes to unwind. In Clarkson's case, this ended up being a couple hours. Clarkson would pour himself a glass of rosé, a seldom reported habit of his that had earned him the teasing nickname of Axel Rosé in the office. When the helicopter did eventually arrive, there was a small problem. Clarkson made it plain in no uncertain terms that he wasn't going to get on the helicopter until he poured and drank himself a few more glasses. It was at this point series scriptwriter Richard Porter had had enough and recused himself from the studio. It was expected that Clarkson, Hammond and May would return to the hotel in time for supper to be served at 8 PM. However, the helicopter would be kept waiting for over 2 whole hours, meaning they wouldn't get back until 9:30, with Clarkson thoroughly inebriated. Upon the trio's arrival at the hotel and fearing a scene, several members of the Top Gear production team would go to bed as soon as they arrived at Symonston, which in hindsight was perhaps not the wisest idea. Prior to arriving at the hotel, it was understood that a chef would be on hand to provide the team with cooked meals, in particular an 8-ounce sirloin steak with fondant potatoes, pan-fried wild mushrooms, grilled cherry tomatoes and peppercorn sauce for Jeremy Clarkson. But because Clarkson and his 2 co-presenters had kept the rest of the team waiting for so long back at the studio, the chef had decided to cut his losses, call it a night and left. By the time they had arrived at close to 10 o'clock at night, the only people still left in the hotel was receptionist Sue Ward and her close family, who were witness to what happened over the next half hour. As they made their way towards the kitchen, the first person to approach Clarkson once he arrived at Symonston was Ward's brother-in-law Bob, who asked him for a selfie. Clarkson then brusquely rejected him by declining the photo due to the day he'd had. As Bob, his wife Denise and brother Alan casually swigged down some drinks, they then heard Clarkson yelling at the top of his lungs upon hearing that there was no catering staff available to prepare the steak he had wanted. The team instead presented with an uncooked meat and cheese platter. His blame immediately shifted to veteran Top Gear producer of 10 years, Oisin Tiemann, and began berating him for his Irish background among other perceived slights. Allegedly, every single swear word in the book would be used against Tiemann as he drunkenly scuffled towards him, with others trying to hold him back. He then, quote-unquote, smacked Tiemann in the face. At the time, Clarkson would get his way as the hotel's own general manager would cook Clarkson a steak off his own back for the measly sum of £21, and he'd retire to his room in a very grumpy mood. In a manner that echoed the Repton-era miscreant that still lay dormant inside the much older Clarkson's body, he'd smoke in his non-smoking room, costing the cleaning team a further £1,000. The morning of the 5th of March 2015 was an understandably chaotic one, made no less hectic by the snow that had fallen overnight. Initially, the rest of the team were confused as to whether or not production on the program was set to continue, with May and Hammond eventually opting to spend the 5th of March filming without Clarkson, who took the day off by staying in the hotel and whittling away the hours on his laptop, digitally penning the first of many apology letters towards Tiemann and the rest of the Top Gear team. A single blurry photograph of Clarkson standing on the patio of the hotel looking eerily spectre-like is the look of a broken man in mourning. A distant, forlorn figure enveloped by bitterly cold winds and an uncertainty of the future, or whether or not he'd even be around to experience it, gazing emptily towards ice and fog-smothered hills, in a way the final burial plot for his long and storied career on Top Gear. We couldn't see his face, but its expression would have conveyed only defeat and the knowledge that everything he'd worked for the last 13 years was over. Top Gear had become Clarkson's own Roman Empire, almost literal in the sense it had captivated the world by storm with its worldwide cumulative audience of 350 million people. And now he was its Nero, fiddling away as it silently burned in the background. His Ford Fiesta would remain parked up in front of the hotel, gathering snow, and its absence in this YouTube video filmed by the user known as Eeny and uploaded to the website on the 8th, from the day after the fracas. It should be worth noting that this short clip, as I presently speak, doesn't even have 1,000 views, and yet is among the most important piece of media that presently exists for Top Gear during its very final days, other than Ian May's still photograph of James May's Porsche. This was the point Jeremy Clarkson had hit absolute rock bottom. If the team had tried to go public with what had happened the night before, there's little doubt he probably would have got himself in even worse trouble. By keeping things under the radar for a few days, it granted Clarkson a sorely needed grace period to reflect on himself. He had time to calm down and begin planning out his next moves. By the morning of the 6th, most of the Top Gear production team, Porter included, had been briefed over the incident and were understandably dejected, with Porter crashing out on his sofa, feeling a general sentiment that he'd been betrayed. The weekend would proceed to pass by at an agonizingly slow pace, the general population still completely unaware of what had happened, as the 7th episode of Top Gear's 22nd series would hit TV screens. Finally, on the morning of the 9th of March, Jeremy Clarkson would report the altercation to management figures within the BBC, telephoning channel controller Danny Cohen, and was promptly suspended. He'd then head to the Top Gear production office for what turned out to be the final time in his career, apologising to the production crew in what Porter felt was a half-hearted apology, and left without even taking his jacket off. And once the news hit publicly in the hours that followed, a virulent media frenzy quickly ensued.
What did you do, Jeremy?
Sorry.
Any regrets, Jeremy? Any regrets?
Oh, yeah.
Jeremy, about what you've done?
No, means I'm going to be able to get to the Chelsea match.
Jeremy, what was it about? Jeremy, what was it about? Jeremy.
Throughout the span of about 2 weeks, the areas near Clarkson and May's residences were swarmed 24/7 with paparazzo foot traffic. Some paid members of the press with camcorders at the ready to record anything that passed through the two Top Gear hosts' lips. Others nosy fans running around with a mobile phone who wanted a glimpse of a man who had gone over the edge and wanted nothing more than some time alone. Prior to the year 2015, the word fracas was one of those words that was in the Oxford English Dictionary but had long since fallen out of common usage. It was up there with words like despotic in terms of borderline obscurity, even within academic circles, but what Jeremy Clarkson did in the presence of Oshin Tiemann was enough to bring the word back into the public vernacular once more. By the night of the 10th, the controversy was already being discussed on that night's episode of Newsnight, as print publications all across the country got to work preparing the following morning's headlines. As the fracas became public knowledge, reaction to the BBC suspension was almost universally condemned, reaching up to and including the outgoing Prime Minister of the era, David Cameron, with controversial journalist Paul Staines, better known by his online pseudonym Guido Fawkes, launching a petition calling for Clarkson's reinstatement to Top Gear, through a campaign titled BBC, Bring Back Clarkson. And by the 20th, the signatures had surpassed the 4 million, hand delivering them to Parliament in a tank with the help of a man dressed up as the Stig, whose low-budget costume didn't even feature a real helmet, leading to some jokingly referring to him as the Stig's homeless cousin, among others. This was in contrast against a parallel petition which called for Clarkson's firing, which, although not as directly exposed to the media hailstorm that had developed, still only managed to garner 12,700 signatures by the time of reportage on the 12th. But in truth, the BBC had already made their mind up behind closed doors. It was simply far easier for Antubib to start afresh with the spoils of war they now legally owned. A powerful billion-dollar IP, proof that the format had been versatile in overseas markets, and a desire for full creative control that ultimately led them to sack Clarkson. In much the same vein as Richard Hammond's crash in the Vampire Dragster 9 years earlier, news of Clarkson's suspension was front-page news for Wednesday the 11th of March 2015. Top Gear, Strop Gear, and Stop Gear were all among the headlines printed that day, highlighting the unique creativity of British newspaper editors all across the nation. BBC Director General Tony Hall would refuse to issue any sort of comments regarding Clarkson's immediate future. That same day, one of the very first voices to defend Clarkson would be good friend and former Top Gear colleague Chris Goffey, who had known Clarkson very well during the first decade of the latter's career, and whose presentation style Clarkson had modelled his on. In a rare TV appearance following his retirement back in 2004, Goffey would claim Clarkson had always got on with the producers, and that if he did have a bit of a tiff, that was naturally part of his own character and why he had made Top Gear such a big programme in the first place. By the afternoon of the 12th, it was claimed that Clarkson and Tiemann would be seeing eye to eye for the first time in over a week, with the head of BBC Scotland, Ken Macquarie, tasked with investigating the incident before later publishing his findings. This came one day after Clarkson was spotted in the crowd at a Chelsea vs Paris Saint-Germain game, seemingly unfazed by the whole thing going on around him. At 10:45 PM on the 12th of March, the episode of Question Time that aired on BBC One that night would also choose to focus on Clarkson's Fracas. And boy, in the midst of the occasional gallows banter from Hignify host Ian Hislop, was it filled with some genuinely cringeworthy takes.
You know, I watched Top Gear with my 10-year-old stepson. You know, this guy has proved himself to be sexist, to be racist.
Well, it probably won't surprise anyone in the audience or at home to know that I have never watched Top Gear. I think now would be a really good time for him to move on in his life and stop collecting licence fee payers' money and take another job on.
This is very politically incorrect of me, but end of Gone with the Wind. Frank, my idea, I do not give a damn.
On the 14th of March, the BBC News and Sport websites would both go down during the afternoon, with speculative journalists believing that this was in retaliation from a hacker group who supported Clarkson. In an article he penned for The Sun that day, Jeremy would already be referring to his on-screen career on Top Gear in the past tense, likening himself to a dinosaur on the verge of extinction, and that at some point you must wave goodbye to the monsters. On the 15th, the BBC would report that they had lost close to 5 million viewers as the programme that had been called up to take Top Gear's place that week, a repeat of a Red Arrows documentary, only managed to attain 1.3 million people tuning in, as opposed to what was Top Gear's 6.2 million average viewing figure throughout the 7 Series 22 episodes that had aired prior to the Fracas. And as though it were the mother of all bad omens, Derek Smith, the legendary television producer who had birthed the original concept of Top Gear in the car park of Pebble Mill Studios all the way back in the 1970s, passed away at the age of 87. The spirit of Top Gear had literally died in the middle of this controversy. During the next few days, the BBC continued to withhold their verdict on the controversy, stating that they would not be able to issue a definitive verdict until they had heard and recorded the story from both Clarkson and Tieman's perspectives. By the 18th, the two had given their statements, and by the 19th, having grown restless in the meantime, the media circus had now set their sights on Clarkson's two co-presenters, Richard Hammond and James May, who chose not to continue the rest of the series without Jeremy. There had been plans to continue as a full team in the vain hope that the controversy would blow over, as it typically always did, but in this instance that simply wouldn't be the case. And after a few days of lingering uncertainty, the general morale within the Top Gear camp had deteriorated to the point that no one really cared anymore. After days of uncertainty over Top Gear's future and the slight, albeit rapidly waning possibility of his reinstatement, the final nail in the coffin arguably came on the 20th of March 2015. Where attending the BBC Gala at the Roundhouse in Camden, Clarkson would let loose on those who were still technically his superiors, addressing them as f***ing bastards. He'd auction off a lap of the Top Gear test track, a role he was expected to fulfill, Fracas or not, but would continue to make further expletive jabs towards the corporation that night, no doubt greatly embarrassing those present, including Director General Hall. If there was anything left to sway the BBC's opinion on what to do with Clarkson's suspension, that was it. By the 23rd, nearly 3 weeks after the initial altercation, it was expected that the BBC was imminently due to issue a final verdict over the question of Clarkson, as 4 live shows from their 2015 world tour due to occur at the end of March in Norway would be cancelled until further notice. Finally, on the 24th, a senior executive reported to Channel 4 News that the allegations had to be dealt with in a very serious way. And 1 day later, we'd finally find out exactly how serious.
From the BBC Director General Tony Hall about the situation with Jeremy Clarkson, the presenter of Top Gear. The statement reads as follows: "It is with great regret that I have told Jeremy Clarkson today that the BBC will not be renewing his contract. It is not a decision I have taken lightly. I have done so only after a very careful consideration."
On the facts, and this morning that's what I did. It's been a difficult time for the team and of course for the individuals concerned. People love Top Gear and I love Top Gear. Our priority now is to look to the future and how we bring it back in good shape in 2016 whilst recognising it will be different.
On the 25th of March 2015, 13 years and 3 days to the announcement that he was originally set to return to Top Gear, Jeremy Clarkson was officially fired from the programme he had made big. As per various news reports of the era, it is believed that Andy Willman was the first individual from within the Top Gear camp to receive an email from the BBC that confirmed the non-renewal of Clarkson's contract. Ken McQuarrie's report at least had the decency to state it was Clarkson himself who admitted to the initial wrongdoing, but don't assume for a second that McQuarrie's judgment was at all impartial and made without zero outside influence, because it absolutely wasn't. This is because the only other time McQuarrie had been asked to personally intervene with an internal BBC issue was to protect the corporation's own during the initial U-Tree onslaught, one which, in the interest of this documentary, resulted in the firing of the BBC's then current Director General George Entwistle, who had only been Director General for a mere 54 days, in order to replace him with, you guessed it, Tony Hall. Suddenly, Hall's decision to appoint McQuarrie makes a lot more sense. Just two bureaucrats scratching each other's backs. Alan Yentop, the man who had indirectly helped Clarkson onto the original format of Top Gear all the way back in 1988, expressed some form of genuine remorse and denied that Clarkson had actually been given the sack, but rather that they had decided simply not to renew his contract, which in this instance was technically the truth. James May would be continually hounded by news outlets in the hours following Clarkson's firing being made official, who all gathered around his front door as though he'd magically held all the answers they were looking for. Leave it to him to provide some sorely needed comic relief at such a tense time.
Well, I've only known for the past few minutes, and if you'll excuse me, I very desperately have to write the eBay listing for my Ferrari.
Even with all the available evidence laid bare of the mental instability Clarkson was undergoing at the time, it seems impossible to justify what he did. But it seemed abundantly clear that the likes of Cohen, Hall, McQuarrie and anyone else involved were simply not interested in the slightest in pursuing any sort of diplomatic approach for a single second of their despicable grandstanding. They just wanted to continue escalating the situation. Indeed, these sentiments can be reflected in Clarkson's prior admission that he was to consider quitting the BBC regardless if he'd been found guilty of any wrongdoing or not. Rumours even swirled at the time that ITV had been making plans at the beginning of 2015 for a brand new car-themed panel show whose development coincided with the end of the trio's contracts. Whatever was to happen in the coming days and weeks, it was fairly clear that the levels of trust between Top Gear's innermost camp and the BBC had now sunk extremely low, deteriorating to such a point that fracture was inevitable. And although Clarkson publicly thanked his many fans for their support, the matter of his future on Top Gear was entirely out of his hands and truthfully had been since the beginning of March. Some punters would make jokes of the whole situation given the coincidental timing of Clarkson officially parting ways with Top Gear on the very same day that Zayn Malik left One Direction, and although this did help to lighten the mood a bit, what was perhaps the most disgusting thing to come out throughout the entire scandal was an anonymous BBC insider who compared what Clarkson did to Jimmy Savile. Accusations that rightfully rattled Clarkson so much, he threatened legal action in retaliation, although nothing would ultimately come of this. Ultimately, after 2 to 3 years of ceaseless mudslinging towards the trio from all sides and a general failure to stand up for one of their most valued talents during a general crisis period for the BBC, given the damning revelations of Operation U-Tree, the corporation had finally caved to the pressure, all the while finding a worthwhile opening to claim Top Gear and all its associated spoils for themselves. And at this point, they just wanted Clarkson gone. Rather bizarrely, the BBC would not even allow Jeremy back into the hangar to film studio scenes, nor partake in any further shooting beyond what they'd already recorded prior to the fracas, his position in the studio taken up by a literal fiberglass elephant in the room, but strangely would allow him to finish his voiced-over dialogues in the recording studio as though there was some sort of marked difference between the two. They also wouldn't ban him outrightly from the BBC, allowing him to make his 16th and to date final appearance as guest host of Have I Got News For You, kicking off its 50th series. In the form it released, the closing episode of Top Gear's 22nd series was never going to break any sort of record. The only way it could was if it was preceded by an announcement that Clarkson had been cleared of all wrongdoing and the show renewed for another series. Everyone, their mother, and their dog knew this would ultimately be the end of Top Gear. No matter how good it was, no one wanted to watch an episode of Top Gear knowing that Jeremy Clarkson was never going to be on it ever again. Though the episode proved to be an absolute barnstormer and became a firm fan favourite in the years that followed, the whole thing seemed to be made entirely in poor taste. A contractual obligation episode at best, and a senseless humiliation ritual at worst. a malfeasant production orchestrated by Cohen and Hall to eye a 9 million viewing figure by any means necessary, with which they would then proceed to take all the credit for and subsequently barter with networks all over the globe who had become disillusioned with Top Gear to prove that its enduring success was not a fluke and that they could then subsequently sell them on the new format, which they knew full well from day zero would not be as good or as big as what it was going to replace. Ultimately, the joke would be on the BBC. It's just a shame it came at everyone else's expense. The word fracas, seldom used other than for headlines of a similar nature, experienced a noticeable resurgence with its all-time usage peaking on the 10th of March 2015, 299 years after its first recorded usage. There was a 400% increase in people merely looking up the term to see what it meant. For weeks after the fracas, speculation would be rife over what would replace Top Gear, if anything, and what network its former hosts would ultimately sign with many theorising Clarkson would finally make good on those few teasing discussions he had with Simon Fuller and join the BBC's immediate rival ITV, with a show that would go toe-to-toe against Top Gear. The BBC would continually engage itself in its massive, many-tentacled media machine in the meanwhile, mustering a modicum of fabricated interest in a televisual corpse it had killed and was now trying to shock back into life. Within 24 hours of Clarkson's firing being made official, the team would be inundated with offers all across the world, including a Russian network, a Qatari network, and several different firms based out of America who all wanted Clarkson's patronage. On the evening of the 29th, Clarkson would be met at the Assagi Italian restaurant in Notting Hill by a trio of familiar faces: Richard Hammond, James May, and Andy Wellman. There was no steak and chips on the menu this time around, but the purposes of their meeting were immediately obvious to anyone within earshot. They were about to do unto the BBC what the BBC had done to them. They'd go over who they wanted to approach in the coming weeks, but ultimately very little would be achieved that night. By the 19th of April, 3 weeks later, Jeremy Clarkson publicised in an ultimatum in that week's Sunday Times article he'd lost his baby at Top Gear, but that he'd be having another. That is to say, Top Gear was over, but the circus would continue under a new name. The growth in his tongue had turned out not to be cancer after all. It had since deflated on its own accord and left a discernible hole. A hole comparable in size to the one in Clarkson's heart, now that he no longer had Top Gear to fall back on. By the beginning of May, Clarkson would join his two co-hosts as they resumed their final live tour of the UK, filming a teasing little taster for what was to become their next project. As developments continued throughout the summer, the team would be struck a blow after it was revealed that they wouldn't be able to work for any British televisual networks such as ITV until 2017 at the absolute earliest, due to a non-compete clause in their pre-existing BBC contracts. Reportedly, the ITV gave them a great offer, but with the BBC stipulation in place, there wasn't much they could do about it. By the 30th of July 2015, it was officially announced that online retail giant Amazon had purchased the trio's contracts and would be signing them to Amazon Prime on a 3-season deal worth £75 million, with Clarkson receiving £10 million a year over the course of the 3 series, and his 2 broadcasting partners receiving £7.2 million each. This significantly dwarfed any contract they had previously earned on the BBC, with the Beeb having stumped up a mere £1 million for Clarkson in its final years and £500,000 each for Hammond and May. In the months that followed this announcement, Top Gear would begin hemorrhaging key staff, particularly those not bound to the station, who left the programme and the network as a whole in droves. Along with Richard Hammond and James May, which the BBC continually reiterated would continue to host Top Gear when it came back in 2016, the programme lost an awful lot of people that the BBC didn't bank on losing. This was caused by nothing more than the naivety of Danny Cohen and Tony Hall, thinking that because Clarkson was the only party that had committed any wrongdoing, that he would mutually part ways with his old team and go his own way, that he was disgraced and would peacefully remove himself from the Top Gear equation. But as the petition calling for Clarkson's reinstatement proved, Jeremy had remained an endearingly popular presenter, not just with the outside world, but with the team he had worked for so many years. And at the end of the day, loyalty trumped obedience. With all possible timelines that emerged from March 2015, there just wasn't a single one where Hammond and May would ever have happily continued working without their beloved compadre. James May probably said it the best.
Who would you be prepared to work with? Who would you like to work with?
Much as I think he's a knob, I quite like working with Jeremy.
At some point in the summer of 2015, Jeremy Clarkson would enjoy his final ever lap around the Top Gear test track. When he arrived to the track, the show's portable production office where everything had happened had already been locked up to prevent Clarkson from taking a souvenir. Not that Andy Woolman hadn't already looted it of everything of worth anyway, such as the show's awards. Over the previous 13 years, the track itself had been scarred after thousands of laps, both on the programme and outside of it. A missing landing light demolished by the Black Stig in an Aston Martin Vanquish all the way back in Series 1. The tyre wall knocked into its defined formation by the Koenigsegg that had bitten a chunk out of it in Series 8, and perhaps more recently, a pair of deep divots left in the field, caused by Clarkson spinning out in the BMW 1 Series. Also present for this special day was Clarkson's good old friend Nick Mason, who brought along his LaFerrari, and future McLaren Formula 1 team boss Zak Brown, who along with his two sons bid a gargantuan £50,000 for the opportunity to be present that day. Along with Mason's LaFerrari, there was also a brand new Ferrari 488, effectively the great-great-grandchild of the 355 he had fallen in love with 20 years earlier, and a Mercedes AMG GTS. He'd do many reminiscing laps of the circuit, getting used to how each of the three cars felt, but chose against driving any of them in anger until his final timed lap. The car he would ultimately choose for this purpose is a closely guarded secret, but we know that after he did it, one of the female guests announced that she hadn't actually had a lap as everyone was packing up. And with the Ferraris already on their way back home, Clarkson loaded her into the passenger seat of the AMG and took them both for one last spin, shredding the Merc's tyres in one final, ultimate act of defiance. In a way, it was like August 2001 all over again. The slate had been wiped well and truly clean, except instead of scribbling show ideas on a crumpled napkin in the back of a London taxi, it was day after day of frustrated phone calls from the comfort of a £1 million penthouse in Kensington, which he'd spent the previous 4 years living in. It was here he'd begin putting together what became the Grand Tour. In the meantime, the BBC's attempt to revive Top Gear in May 2016 can perhaps take pride of place as one of the worst, if not the worst, reboot in televisual history. From the first minute it aired, Chris Evans' antics were so downright diabolical they ended up sinking his on-screen career entirely and trashed Top Gear's reputation to the point it never fully recovered. And for that unforgivable indiscretion, he is person of interest number 6. Not that the BBC ever bothered to listen, mind you, as despite 3 complete changes of personnel in the 3 years that followed, and the absolute maximum in damage control from the usual suspects such as Tim Davie, who is the 7th and final person of interest, who claimed one series of Chris Evans made more money for Top Gear than the 22 with Clarkson did. The series floundered and flopped until the BBC were left with absolutely no choice but to pull the plug after Freddie Flintoff's near-fatal injury. Not even after moving Top Gear to BBC One, eliminating all competing programming that was on the other side, printing, among hundreds of others, some utterly delusional headlines that claimed Top Gear was as good as it had ever been, or in one case, the best it had ever been, the latter of which I can confidently state, no Mr. Harris, no it absolutely f***ing wasn't. All the while deriding the Grand Tour as a tired old TV show that was followed by a listless army of zombie lads, along with perhaps a little bit of under-the-table payola to influence viewing figures, were ever quite enough to keep a shattered, sinking, captainless ship from eventually inevitably capsizing, accident or not. Frankly, given the trajectory of the viewing figures for the last couple of series headed by Harris but really fronted by Flintoff and McGuinness, Top Gear would probably have wound itself on the chopping block within another 2 to 3 years at most anyway. In reality, Top Gear died from the minute Clarkson physically assaulted a Shin Tiemann on the 4th of March 2015, was taken to hospital on the 9th, was pronounced clinically brain dead by the 25th, and was finally pulled off its life support shortly after 9:15 PM on the 28th of June, with May being the last person to leave the operating theatre in February the following year, as he finished his last of 6 Car of the People specials. What happened in the 6 years after that, in the shortest amount of words possible, was merely zombie Top Gear. An intellectual Frankenstein cobbled together from the remains of a 20-year-old TV format, a couple presenters who genuinely earned their spot, and many more who didn't. It was a show the BBC tried their absolute hardest to shove down Top Gear fans' throats, but in the end it was just purely disposable television at some of its most expensive. On the 24th of September 2016, the Grand Tour would celebrate its launch party in a manner that was otherworldly levels of awesome. costing £2.5 million to make, a factor that many newspapers, especially The Guardian, tried to beat over our heads ad nauseum as though the British taxpayer were actually fronting the cost. Those opening shots in the Mojave Desert felt like something out of Mad Max. In a way, this was the day that Clarkson's career would reach its ultimate apex and leave the BBC in the dust. On a stage in the middle of California, he was surrounded by thousands of people who had travelled from all over the world to attend the inaugural shooting, all of whom were consumed with an undying adoration for the man and the programme that had defined so much of their lives. But the mark had been made, the BBC were put on notice, and 2 months later the sun would rise again on the Three Boys as the grand tour would premiere on Amazon Prime. The comic relief had danced and pranced on the ashes of Top Gear, and now it was time for the real show to begin. And although there were more than a fair few hiccups along the way, begin it very much did. Indeed, in March 2017, Clarkson would attend Camden venue the Roundhouse's 10th anniversary charity gala, for which BBC Director General Tony Hall would be in the audience. Auctioning off a lap at the Ebola-drome, the Grand Tour's new track, Clarkson decided that in a spot of karmic déjà vu, the opportunity presented was far too good to resist, and singled out Hall's presence at the event. He reminisced upon his 2015 firing, stating that he may have had some choice words to say about the BBC's management and got sacked, but as a result of that, he'd done very well for himself in the meantime. He then turned to address Hall directly, before pointing towards him and letting loose 2 final verbal torpedoes. "You lose." And with that, we now come to my final judgment. In the question as to who killed Top Gear, a lot of people would instinctively square the blame entirely on Jeremy Clarkson as the one and only culprit for putting his hands to Oshin Timon's face. But I'd strongly disagree with that sentiment, and if you've been paying attention, I can't imagine you'd be willing to blame him either. Because this was not a man who had lashed out as a mere prima donna who wanted some hot food. This was a man who over the previous year had been mentally beaten to within an inch of his life. And after 3 hard years at the BBC was now given the option to have that abuse continue for a new 3-year contract that was to be valid until the point he did quit, or to instead grant himself some sweet, sorely needed release. To have lost his mother, the person who was as good as Clarkson's own personal therapist, to have lost his family, to be accused by a power-tripping US citizen of causing offence and having that person's accusations affect genuine change in his life, when he should have been none of their business. To have a newspaper pick away at your past, finding anything they could to depict you as a cold-hearted racist. To have effectively worked 24/7 for the previous 9 months without anything of a break, in a job that involved entertaining 350 million people across 200 countries. To be physically attacked by a group of crazed Argentinian hoodlums who wanted his head on a pike, and nearly succeeded because of the impotence of the country's law enforcement to actually enforce law. To have such a harrowing, frightening experience then be cavalierly brushed off by his higher-ups at the BBC who didn't care that he was nearly their first worker to be killed in action since Jill Dando in 1999 and who wouldn't even speak to him face-to-face, instead electing to communicate through a network of human proxies. To be verbally attacked by some random Liverpudlian rag over something he didn't actually say that had been taken massively out of context. And perhaps most devastatingly of all, to have gone to the studio only 48 hours removed from being told by his doctor that the lumps on his tongue needed immediate medical attention. Jeremy Clarkson was a man who had had the world thrown at him, and he tried to stand tall for as long as humanly possible. And in the end, over an 8-ounce sirloin steak and some fondant potatoes, Clarkson finally snapped. But in spite of all this, to Danny Cohen's disbelief, Clarkson understood that what he did that night was wrong, and realised that in a moment of madness he had acted most unfairly in a fit of drunken rage. A state that had been exacerbated by an unusual amount of stress that had mounted over more than a year and had not been given an adequate outlet to vent. Combine that with a deadly cocktail of alcohol intoxication and the worries that an impending life-changing illness was about to bring to the doorstep of Clarkson's life, and it's no wonder he finally lost it. In that fateful moment, Clarkson probably didn't see a concerned co-worker trying to de-escalate a potential situation. He saw the personification of all his fears and inadequacies brought to life as he helplessly stumbled around the floor of the Symonston Hall, the weight of the world crushing him down through every word and action he publicised. In the days that followed, it was clear there was no genuine ill will harboured between Clarkson and Timon, otherwise it would have been Timon who went to the BBC immediately following the fracas, rather than stay quiet and allow Clarkson to come forward 4 days later. The pair would settle towards the end of 2015, with Tiemann receiving a mere £100,000 in compensation, and they quietly went their separate ways. And had the show been allowed to continue, it's not entirely unreasonable to expect that they would have reconciled and continued to work with each other once the dust had been allowed to settle. Because it should have been obvious to everyone within the Top Gear team that Jeremy Clarkson was not consumed by a genuine hatred of Oshin Tiemann. He was a man who clearly loved his job, and not just the team, but the family he'd created over the course of 13 years. And in the simplest terms possible, it wasn't something he wanted to lose. Rather tragically, that's exactly what would happen, and it would be his own hand that gave Top Gear its literal death blow. But if there's any solace to be had, unless the BBC underwent a major restructuring in personnel and started to stand up for its biggest personality instead of treating him like a politically incorrect Icarus, Top Gear was almost certainly on its last legs at this point and likely would have not lasted beyond another 9 to 12 months, chiefly owing to the direction in which the BBC was steadfastly committed to heading. It was a BBC where the likes of Jeremy Clarkson had no future, and if Danny Cohen was ever to sit in the throne of Director General, said future would be very short and also become an unavoidable certainty. He then subsequently tried to hold himself to account, informing the BBC what had happened, and never bore any grudge against Tiemann, the man that he wronged, to the point he even told journos point blank to leave him alone.
Leave Osh alone, because none of this is his fault.
What the media then did over the next 3 weeks was turn what should have been a relative non-event settled professionally behind closed doors into a nationwide clown show, because the BBC's higher-ups, who had been trying their hardest to fire Jeremy Clarkson for at least a year, and in truth had probably been trying as far back as Better Six's dissolution in September 2012, finally had a real shot at achieving their goals, especially after Hall had shot down Danny Cohen's demand for Clarkson's firing a year earlier. For that, I feel Clarkson is ultimately not guilty. The changing face of the BBC took one good look at Top Gear and decided it was no longer compatible with the brand image that the corporation wanted to show to the world, despite the show being their biggest breadwinner for a considerable amount of time. And whereas other shows like QI were as easy to refit as merely booting out the lead presenter and sticking in someone similarly minded, but with the opposite set of genitals, a program like Top Gear would need a much more extensive rethink, and getting rid of Clarkson was paramount. It was something that was going to have to happen, if not in March 2015, then probably by the end of the show's run that April. Maybe he'd have lasted another series or two if he played his cards right, but ultimately, you were never going to stop the crushing bureaucracy of the BBC from getting what they wanted: Clarkson gone, and an empty canvas with which they'd remodel Top Gear into vegan sausage roll flop gear. But before I issue my final judgment, there is one last opinion towards the Fracas that I haven't talked about yet, and for good reason. That opinion belonged to Top Gear scriptwriter Richard Porter. In his 2015 autobiography and On That Bombshell, Porter would not hold back in his scathing attack against not only Clarkson, but those who had chosen to support him during this trying time. He accused Clarkson as having felt zero genuine remorse for his actions and ultimately making the whole situation about himself, rather than the entire Top Gear team he had wronged. He would also fire back at the million people, including myself, who signed Guido Fawkes' petition in what wouldn't be the last time Richard Porter would stoop to insulting his own fanbase. He'd address those of us who had signed the petition as people who felt it was okay for a colleague to smack you in the mouth, so long as some stranger felt you were a good bloke. And although the book was indeed written in the immediate months following the Fracas and certainly subject to a fair degree of recency bias owing to the pent-up rage that was no doubt stored inside him, I'd like to issue a retrospective rebuttal and explain why I signed that petition, as did half of my sixth form history group. And it was not, as Porter so ignorantly proclaimed, because I liked people being smacked in the mouth. I signed that petition because even as a teenager I could see the intense amount of stress that Jeremy Clarkson had been put through during the previous year leading up to his meltdown. I signed it because I believed a TV station that hired talent such as Clarkson should at least have had the decency to talk to him directly instead of just callously slagging him off in the press at every chance they got. I signed it because even in those days I could see how begrudgingly ungrateful the BBC management were that they had to endure Clarkson consistently bringing the company the lion's share of profit every single year when they wanted to promote newer, trendier series instead. I signed it because after the BBC had spent the better part of 4 decades or more viciously defending all the sick predators that had roamed within its ranks such as Jimmy Savile, Rolf Harris and Stuart Hall, it didn't even have the heart to get behind someone who was content having eyes for people his own age. I signed it because I'd grown infuriatingly tired over seeing Jeremy Clarkson's name repeatedly dragged through the coals every few months because the gutter press had yet again misinterpreted something he'd said. Furthermore, there's something else I'd like to point out, and he isn't going to like hearing this. On that night, Porter wasn't there. By his own admission, he went home that night and didn't learn of the fracas until Friday morning. Though his insight into the Top Gear crew was certainly far greater than 99% of the general public, his perception of that night in particular is the same as anyone else's because he wasn't actually there. Any subsequent perception from his end was an imagined construct based on an idealized account of what had actually happened. To have merely busted Oshin Tieman's lip in the middle of a drunken stupor as per the findings of Ken McQuarrie's report was not the sort of infraction that normally led to someone being discarded from a production after that many years, nor did it reveal an intent from Clarkson to cause permanent damage whilst in a clearly impaired state. There is a clear difference between punching someone out of genuine fury and leaving them a bloodied heap on the floor, and landing a lucky jab whilst stumbling about in an alcohol-fueled fugue state. With the anecdotes and sensationalized media spin that exists, much of which depicted Clarkson as some ruthless prize-fighting boxer, there was never enough evidence to actually suggest what Clarkson did that night was out of genuine malice and an intent to beat the living tar out of Oshin Tieman. If that was the case, Mark 1 Alpha's report from the studio floor in Dunsfold would have been far less flattering. You'd have seen signs in the hours leading up to the fracas. At best, what Clarkson had involved himself in was a mere incident, a night that should have been forgotten about as quickly as Tieman's lips managed to heal. But the BBC had spent a year baying for blood, and this was their ultimate, possibly final shot at getting rid of Clarkson, owing to the impending renewal of his contract. And it was a shot they had to take. If Richard Porter felt a genuine sense of loss over a TV program he'd spent close to 20 years of his life working on, which is certainly understandable given the context, then with all due respect, how did he think Jeremy Clarkson felt during the previous year, having lost his mother, his marriage, his house, and the job he'd been doing, save for a 3-year hiatus in the middle, since the time Porter was still wearing blazers and going to assembly every morning? To choose to continue clocking into work mere days after being preemptively diagnosed with a potentially life-threatening illness. From my limited perspective, it seemed to me that Clarkson was as repentant as he could have possibly been, owing to the life situation he was experiencing at the time. To expect any more than that is to be completely disingenuous. Causing Top Gear's premature end was certainly regrettable on Clarkson's part, but not something he had consciously intended to bring about while sober. It was a job he clearly loved doing and would have done until he was old, grey and dilapidated, but he had seen the writing on the wall and knew his day was coming sooner or later. To me, he didn't kill Top Gear. He couldn't have, because to kill it, he had to be lucid, sober and harbour a distinct hatred of his job, none of which he exhibited during that night. A night that by all rights should have been forgotten as quickly as Tieman's lips had managed to heal. So at the end of the day, who really killed Top Gear? Was it Tony Hall, the shameless Director General who wanted to get rid of Clarkson by any means necessary, and celebrated when his new version of Top Gear made only a fraction of the numbers its much-vaunted predecessor did? Was it Danny Cohen, the smug, self-important, snivelling sycophant in charge of BBC Two who was hell-bent on making Clarkson bend to his will, the demands of his captive audience be damned? Was it Ken McQuarrie, Hall's impotent number 2 whose job was simply to formalise Clarkson's firing without stepping out of company line and making sure it remained towed throughout? Was it Somi D'Souza, the narcissistic busybody obsessed with retelling her life story over and over again from an increasingly distorted and kinkier perspective to anyone unfortunate enough to listen? Was it Lawrence Davies, the grifting, race-baiting lawyer who was willing to hear anyone who held even the slightest grievances over Top Gear, regardless of their validity or mental acuity, and thought a TV show was a more worthwhile focus of his time and energy than genuine human rights violations? Was it Chris Evans, the insufferable carrot-top mug who wanted to drive Top Gear into a new era and instead ended up being kicked to the curb after a mere 6 episodes? Or was it Tim Davie, Tony Hall's coattail rider who became Director General once Hall had been vanquished, and who celebrated every small success his superior experienced, regardless of whether they were critically panned by a vast majority of their audience? Personally, I think it was all of them. Some of them got their eventual comeuppance, such as Hall, who after celebrating that his version of Top Gear wasn't a complete failure in 2020 during his last night at the company, would later be exposed for his role in Martin Bashir's 1995 Princess Diana interview and left the company a disgraced man not long after, his image irreparably tarnished among the sweet smell of crocodile tears. Chris Evans virtually killed his career overnight, as not only was he dismissed from Top Gear, but in the very same week it had been announced by Channel 4 that his freshly revived TFI Friday would not be renewed. And to be honest, that's exactly what you get for trying to take someone else's mantle. For the others, however, we shall have to wait and see. So with all that said, what are my personal feelings towards what happened in March 2015? I think at the end of the day, the Fracas was a nigh-on unavoidable situation owing to the conditions and tense working environment that had been promulgated by the BBC, who simply refused to give its most valuable presenter an easy time on the set. At its core, Jeremy Clarkson just did not want to spend another 3 years at a TV network that clearly hated him and was slowly effacing his will to live during what was already the worst year of his life. To me, the way Richard Porter reacted to what happened in his autobiography was ultimately uncalled for and pushed much too far in the opposite direction, becoming so much of a team player that he had forgotten the individual. If you're genuinely going to act like that and take someone you'd worked with for the last 13 years' actions at face value instead of stopping to question what exactly had turned him into that monster, then he should probably have considered leaving the Top Gear circus outright to join something a little more slower paced and grounded. To me, the fact that 40 episodes of the Grand Tour passed by without even the slightest backstage incident being reported is damning enough evidence that it was the BBC that was the real problem and not Clarkson. And these sentiments seem to actually be quite founded, as mere days after putting the finishing touches on this video script, James May would come out of the blue and talk about the controversy on the eve of its 10th anniversary, stating that he felt Top Gear didn't have to end in March 2015 and that things could have been patched up. These are opinions he'd more or less had consistently held the entire time, as can be evidenced by what he said during his impromptu doorstep interviews, and from a personal standpoint I wholeheartedly agree with him. Top Gear did not have to end that night. May gets it bang on the money by stating that had they been a heavy metal band, no one would have so much as batted an eyelid. It was only natural that someone under high levels of stress such as Jeremy Clarkson would occasionally go off the rails, but the BBC had locked themselves into an agenda that they desperately wanted to execute, an agenda that ended up destroying the good name of Top Gear and robbed us of the most entertaining TV programme on the planet for the next 18 months. It's a shame that what transpired happened in the manner that it did, because from a business perspective, all signs pointed towards Top Gear being on the cusp of a major resurgence. Their worldwide simulcast deal gave the corporation so much money in those first 2 years that Tim Davie then tried to pretend it was Chris Evans that had made Top Gear such a roaring success and not the historic work of Jeremy Clarkson. Even if the Fracas had happened, there were still other more pragmatic options for the BBC to consider, and had they pursued them, there is little doubt in my mind that Top Gear would have returned to 2007 levels of cultural dominance. Instead, egos prevailed, and the team would be whisked away by Amazon, a career stage that had a few more downs than some might have initially anticipated, but was definitely a worthwhile chapter for the team, with Clarkson going on record as to state that had they remained at the BBC, they probably would have jumped the shark at some point, but at least they would have done it at home. Quite regrettably, the story of Top Gear as we once knew it drew to a close, not with a bang, but with a whimper before a slow, inevitable fade into something that was undeniably lesser. The BBC carried on completely oblivious to the mass fan rejection of its newer format that clearly wasn't working, cycling through new hosts and new formats, with each successive iteration met with an increasingly dwindling level of enthusiasm from a core audience who had largely already moved on and were busy watching the Grand Tour instead. And if you've been living under a rock this past year and a half and somehow still haven't seen my Flop Gear video, which now has 2 million views and counting, I presented a good 100 or so reasons as to why, although the war was quite bloody and a victor unclear for a surprisingly long amount of time, the Grand Tour undeniably won out in the long run. From TV ratings to IMDb ratings to lessened iPlayer streams to the seemingly endless revolving door of hosts who couldn't do their job, crashing cars their limited skill set was incapable of driving, to the Top Gear YouTube account's most watched videos, especially once you factor in the Grand Tour's most watched videos, to the general decline of the magazine and several popular Top Gear communities, Final Gear included, to the third-party content and memes produced from Top Gear, and whose era they were predominantly sourced from, to the sheer lack of originality presented within the show itself, shamelessly cribbing some of its most iconic moments, all while stripping them of their original significance, to its skewed perspective of what it thought an emotional moment constituted, to its insulting lack of research in regards to the SSC speed record scandal or what the human rights in Borneo were, to senselessly wrecking an ultra-rare right-hand drive Matra Bagheera for a road trip in that country that basically no one cared about, in a series of equally forgettable road trips that make the trio's India special look like Vietnam in comparison, to the lack of star power in their beyond tired interpretation of the reasonably priced car format, combining literal who's with those who had been personally scorned by Clarkson's words, all the way to the fact it didn't even bother with getting a yearly live show going again, despite the fact it was an enterprise that brought the corporation an extra 50 million quid every single year. Because deep down, although it ended up taking 7 whole years and some sad, senseless bloodshed for them to finally realise it, the BBC's Top Gear experiment was nothing but a colossal failure on every possible level and ultimately none other than Tony Hall's responsibility. Firing Jeremy Clarkson was little more than a desperate power move made by an accursed Director General who should have been cast out onto the street many years earlier and whose corporation's severely tarnished image led him to make a drastic decision. And it was a move that time has unequivocally proven was absolutely the wrong one to make, especially from a business perspective. Hall's subsequent downfall, caused by the very own seeds he had sown much earlier in his career, has been an utter joy to watch and a stunning example of karmic retribution at its absolute finest.
25 years ago, myself and everybody believed Bashir we made a mistake. But please don't let that colour the other things that I've done and which I can enumerate, but obviously won't. I've done a hell of a lot for the BBC and I think for the arts. And I regret this one thing that we all got wrong because we were lied to by Martin Bashir 25 years ago.
Watching him squirm on live TV, skin redder than a tomatoes and practically on the verge of tears attempting to defend his credibility, and what we saw was a very weak man who didn't like it when he ended up being hoisted by his own petard. Of the 7 people of interest, Tony Hall no doubt had the biggest role in killing Top Gear, as he was the one whose finger was above the button that controlled whether or not Jeremy Clarkson's contract got renewed that April. But it was something he probably wouldn't have been able to do without the help of the other 6. Without Danny Cohen, he wouldn't have felt pressured to make such a rash and radical decision in the first place. Without Somi D'Souza and a shameless shyster of a solicitor Lawrence Davies, the BBC wouldn't have issued Jeremy Clarkson with the 3 strikes that ultimately did him in. Without Ken McQuarrie having worked on Hall's behalf during the days of U-Tree and helping him get into the position of Director General, he wouldn't have had such a valuable crony to help make his decisions for him. In the end, the Fracas was the perfect example of the BBC's bureaucracy managing to turn a hillock into a highland by taking 2 weeks to come to a decision that they had probably made within a matter of hours, and choosing to cut Clarkson out entirely over realising the position he was in under the naive pretense that James May and Richard Hammond would ever want to continue working for them, now that they knew exactly what the corporation was willing to do to save its public image. Above all else, it's a cold, hard reminder that no show, no matter how iconic, is ever stronger than its weakest link. With a competent bureaucratic structure underneath it, staffed by people who didn't entertain threats from lifeless private American citizens and didn't subject some of their hardest workers to humiliating health checks, instead prioritizing profit over moral grandstanding, Top Gear could have cruised into the 2020s with a gargantuan episode count of 250 or more, ending things when the team ultimately felt it was the right time to do so. As a world that had grown somewhat disinterested in Top Gear throughout the first half of the 2010s began to appreciate that these 3 blokes wouldn't be around to entertain us forever, we might have seen the programme reach its highest ever highs en route to what would have no doubt been a spectacular finish, one that might have even managed to outclass what the Grand Tour brought to the table, which is no mean feat to say the least. For that, it will never be truly forgotten, unlike the 7 that had helped to bring about its orchestrated downfall. In time, their names will all deservedly fade into obscurity, but before they do, this video hopes to have laid bare why they are all names worthy of nothing more than pure scorn, revulsion, and derision. A reason why we cannot have nice things in this world without some nasty individual seeking to tear it all apart. And it's a conclusion you will see in upcoming videos due later this spring on my second channel, which after many months of development hell, will concern the dumbest public transport advert I have ever seen in my entire life, and what I believe to be the first genuine, well-founded attack against the YouTuber known as Whistling Diesel and the cult he has given rise to, in a video that I know is going to be polarizing, one that I sincerely hope you have an open mind towards and are willing to hear me out on. As always, thanks for watching, and I'll see you all in the next video. Take care.
Thank you, thanks for watching. Sorry you can't watch anymore. I am going because I've got to eat some sugar puffs. No. Phone's going.